In this section, we're going to talk about the sense of hearing. So, hearing starts with the ear. We have an outer ear, which is the visible part of the ear, where sound waves arrive. And so, the shape of that outer ear is specially designed to capture sound waves and funnel them down the auditory canal. As these sound waves travel down the auditory canal, they interact with an eardrum. This is a thin membrane that marks the beginning of the middle ear, and sound waves cause the eardrum to vibrate. This then causes the vibration of some small bones that then interact with the cochlea. And so, cochlea is a coiled structure that's filled with fluid that is in the inner ear. And this is where we can find the sensory receptors for sound. So, running through the center of the cochlea is the basilar membrane. And in this, we have these hair cells, which are the actual sensory receptors that are located in the cochlea. Their job is to detect sound waves and then turn them into neural impulses that can then be sent to the brain. So, information after it's transformed into these impulses will travel through the auditory nerve and it will go to the thalamus of the brain. And then it will go to the primary auditory cortex, which are located in the temporal lobes of the brain. So, what exactly are sound waves? Well, when anything that makes noise causes a vibration of air molecules. And what you will have is that you'll have parts of the air where the molecules are more densely packed together and parts where they are more spread out. And this can be represented as a wave where you have the peaks representing where you have the most compression of air molecules, and then a trough where you represent the least density of the air molecules. And so these waves of compression and non compression of air molecules can then travel through the air or through a fluid like water, and then can interact with the ear. So the perception that we have of sound depends on these waves. So the amplitude of the wave is the height, how tall those peaks and troughs are. And the amplitude determines our perception of loudness of the sound. Wavelength, which is the frequency. So looking at the distance from one peak to another peak, this is known as the wavelength, and this determines the perception of pitch. So a very low sounding sound, a very low pitch, will have a much larger wavelength, and a high sound will have a very short wavelength. Now, I should note that there's more to sound than just simply amplitude and wavelength. As you have experienced, in this picture here, you have a violin player, and they could play a note in the exact same note at the exact same volume as, say, a trumpet player. But even though they would have the same amplitude and wavelength, you could still, with as long as you've ever experienced hearing a violin and a trumpet before, you could still say, hey, that sounds like a violin and that sounds like a trumpet. Or even if you don't know the instrument names, you could say that those sound different. And that's because the waveforms are not as simple as what you see in these diagrams here, that there is a complexity to this, because whether you're talking about a violin playing a note or a person singing, there are other sounds being generated Usually, when an instrument plays, they have something called an overtone series where there's actually multiple notes that are coming out due to the resonance of the body of the instrument. Um, and this combination of the many different sounds that are actually being produced at one time makes a violin sound like a violin, makes a trumpet sound like a trumpet, or makes a human singer sound like a human singing. So there is a greater complexity to how we hear sounds and how we process sounds than just simply amplitude or wavelength. Now, how do we understand pitch? There's actually two different ways that we understand that we perceive pitch. One is known as temporal coding, the other is place coding. So when we're talking about really low pitch sounds, the rate at which the hair cells are stimulated is what then triggers our perception of these low frequency sounds. But as we start moving up to higher pitch sounds, then we it's actually what we call place coding, because different cells or different hair cells will respond to different frequencies. It's almost like a little coiled up piano keyboard, where the lower sounds are to one side and the higher sounds are to the other. And so, depending on where exactly that the pitch is, will stimulate a different region of those hair cells, and will help you to perceive that pitch. How do we perceive location of sound? We're actually really good at locating sound. You might have heard some, you hear something, and you can turn and you can look, and usually you can kind of identify where it's coming from. Not always, but if in an ideal circumstance, we can usually do this. In fact, they will use this sometimes to help people in say a very complicated, maybe like an airplane cockpit or in a control station, that if they need an alarm to go off of something warning for you to attend to something, then they'll try to have the alarm come from where the area that you need to attend to see whatever dial or panel or whatever it is that you need to see. So we can be quite good at this. And so when we are trying to estimate the location of a sound, um, we there's a difference. When a sound is coming straight at you, then you would receive information from your ears at the same time. If sound is coming to you from a different direction, though, from straight, then it will interact with one ear before it interacts with the next ear. And so we can use the difference for when the sound interacts with one ear to the other to help us to orient that the sound's coming from a particular direction. Also, when that sound is coming to you from one side, it has to travel through your head. And so, therefore, the quality of the sound on the opposite side will be slightly degraded than the sound that's coming from the original source of it. So through a combination of the delay coming in from one ear to the next and the degradation in the sound quality as it travels through your head before it interacts with the next ear, it helps your brain to determine where the sound was coming from.